Hello, welcome to the program. Europe has begun to fight Russian propaganda. In France, new laws are being drafted to combat misleading or deliberate misinformation in both traditional media outlets and online. The European Union is also planning a debate starting January 17th to outline a strategy to tackle fake news. But what effective tools and strategies can really be used to fight against Russian propaganda? Joining me in the studio to talk about this topic is Ihor Rozkladay, an expert in the Center for Democracy and Rule of Law. Thank you for joining us.
Hello.
So first question, as we know, people really started talking about fake news and to some extent Russia's meddling in American affairs during Donald Trump's campaign for the White House. Of course, and Ukraine has been for several years been a victim of this Kremlin propaganda, even before Moscow seized Crimea. So countering it seems like a difficult task. How would just laws against fake news help? And do you think just legislation is really the best way to counteract this problem?
I think no. I think no, because fake news, it's people want to believe. Frankly speaking, it's something created about something which is not happened or happened, but it's not from those point of view, and then spread it widely, and people react on this fake news. And why fake news successful? Because people want to believe in this fake news. It's not about journalist standards, and not about truth or false. It's about people want to believe.
So it would be the reception of the
reception of the fake news, and that's why I think the only way to fight fake news, of course, we need to some way stop spreading this fake news, especially when we hear about some crucified boy, about genocide of Ukrainian nation on Mongol Tatar invasion, and so on and so on. We know even for this last 3 years, but not even for this last 3 years, fake news was always spread about Ukraine since the beginning of independence, and even before. Even that part of Ukrainians know that Banderovцы, it's something like Nazi. It's also fake news. It's a result of Soviet propaganda spread it for many years. It's not happened these days. It happened many years ago. The only problem now that we have very quick flow of information. We have internet, we have social networks, we have this victory hashtag Zrada перемога in Ukrainian, and that's why very difficult to contradict it, because when someone trying to start react contradict this fake news, they spread it very widely. We had a great example when there was one quite ugly article in Foreign Policy about Ukrainian policy of national memory, and we're trying to ask them for right for reply. Very simple. For Western countries, it's normal procedure, ask to own comments. We waited for months.
The right to answer, we call it right to answer.
Our colleagues waited for months, and during this time there was more than 70 languages translated this article, and you understand that even when they paused this right to reply, the result was zero, because people read first article and none of them read second article. That's why I think in this case very important to first for government to provide very clear, simple messages which could be verified by documents, by some sources, open sources, and to provide as much information as possible on the websites. This information must be published in very also simple way. Just this rule of 3 clicks must be for every public website.
For viewers to understand, the rule of 3 clicks is...
Yep, of course. Second, it's very long term. It's marathon for providing information about some historical facts, about, for example, even about what is the power, because a lot of people in Ukraine don't understand what is power. If something happens, they say who is responsible for some problems? President, head of government, or head of parliament. But sorry, sometimes the responsibility it's about those people who must repair this road, to repair this.
It's more complicated than just
and people do not understand. I think because of lack of education, because a lot of people get education in Soviet time, and there were a lot of transformations during independence, and people do not know who is responsible for what president, for what parliament, and I think this is also very important to start civic education. Very simple ways. For example, I think one of the best way it's some streets light box or exhibitions on the streets. It's very simple. People going to shop, to work, and they could read something which is near the metro station or near some public place.
So the idea would be to develop some sort of critical system into people.
But it must be for a very long time, because if you're trying to provide a lot of information at one time, it will be pressure, and people will try not to receive this information because it's pressure, and people don't like pressure.
But the idea of education brings me to another problem. It's like, as widespread as this problem is, every country deals with it with different kind of fake news, whether in France or here in Eastern Europe. So is it possible in a rule of law or in an educational system, you talked about the 3 clicks, to ensure a standard procedure on a global level, even if the country face different kind of attacks?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure, because you're right that in different countries we have different fakes. For example, if Western European countries are not aware about Ukraine, not much, frankly speaking. And it's very easy to spread any fake about Ukraine, because people don't know what is Ukraine. What is Ukraine? What is its history? Why it's not southern part of Russia, and so on and so on. And the main problem also with educational system and with science system, because a lot of scientists work for many years in some paradigm, and when some state trying to provide their opinion, their voice, these scientists don't want to hear it. We have a great example now, conflict between Ukraine and Poland. Volyn case. Poland says that it was a massacre, case. Ukraine says it was a civil war, and we want to discuss, but we see that Poland don't want to discuss. They have this paradigm, it very popularized during the last 10 years especially. We saw this movie about Volyn, and it's very difficult for them to move for another way to sign to contact. But we understand that both from Ukrainian side and from Polish side there is some scientists who are ready to speak, but this dominating political and pressure is so huge that it's very difficult to move. That's why I think in this case it's a big problem. Also with France, with England, with any other countries, they also have some opinion about Ukraine. And when you're trying to say them, sorry, no, it's very difficult to contradict it, because people, they have image of the world and they don't want to change it. And
it's interesting that you talk about France, because the last New Year's, well, this New Year, for his votes to the press, the French President Emmanuel Macron announced a new legislation against the fake news, but some critics evoked the risk of an attack on the freedom of speech. And just before answering to this question, I would like us to listen to Christophe Deloire, who's working for Reporters Without Borders on this matter, who reacted.
We are not opposed to the principle of a law against fake news. But the point is to be able to write a law without endangering the freedom to reveal things about political, social, economical life. And of course, if a law would allow the governments or the regulatory body to censor contents that they would like to avoid because it would be, I don't know, not very pleasant with them, it would be really dangerous. In order to defend our democracies, and probably our democracies have to be defended in front of the fake news wave, it mustn't be with the ways that the despotic countries use.
So here we face a paradox, which is an interesting paradox. Are potentially despotic tools the best way to defend democracy?
The main problem in legislation, when you're trying to block something or to provide some mechanism which law blocking, there is a great risk that this mechanism will be used against anti-corruption, against any critics of the government. Of course, I agree with this. In case of Ukraine, it's very simple to provide mechanisms, for example, against Russia, because we have enemy, we have de facto war, and we can provide that state aggressor outlets can be protected by freedom of speech. It's easy, it's based on national security and of course of protection of other rights. But in case when you have this flow of information inside countries, when you have no war, when you understand that it's freedom of speech, and there's this very tiny border between protection of freedom of speech and protection of national security. It's really very difficult, and I can say that we will try to develop principles for the states which is under attack. I think maybe this year even we will try to start this project, and we will try to develop principles based on all heritage of legislation, international standards, international agreements developed in the 20th century. We have now a draft, it's called like compendium of all legislation, and it's very interesting. For example, our colleague, she is from USA, and she found a document about prohibition of transmitting from ships which is not under control of the country. Mm-hmm. And I think we have good, maybe forgotten examples how to deal with this, but only developing principles which will be agreed in whole Europe at least, or maybe even USA and other countries, based on these principles we can try to write some legislation norm, but they must be, I think, rather soft. In case of inside our community, of course, when we're talking about contradiction of enemies, these rules could be more effective and more.
And there's obviously an aggressive Russian narrative against Ukraine. You spoke about the European Parliament, and it's, well, Europe in general. And it's quite interesting because the European Parliament agreed to get involved in this fight. Today, the high-level expert group met for the first time. It's 39 experts from from Google, Twitter, and from different medias. So they get involved, seeing the damage it could do to the democratic process. The question would be, what kind of weight does the EU or such structure really have in this process against fake news?
Opinion, I think that the European Union, they trying at least for last 3 years to deal with fake news. They understand, I think they understand very quickly what is it. There was an idea to start a Russian language channel which will broadcast to territory of Russia and or other post-Soviet countries, but I was very skeptical on this idea because you can spread information, but again, you will not get these communities which will be ready to receive this information. It could be very small % of people who are not, they have no influence on some public processes or transformation in the country. That's why I'm rather critical on this. Main risk I see, and maybe this group also could work on it, it's about responsibility of social networks. Because social networks are now very powerful. And we see for the last 3 years that social networks are used by Russian trolls and other persons to block Ukrainian voices. We see that people blocked for months, for even 3 months, and sometimes we don't understand why. Yes, sometimes we see that for pornography, but there was no pornography. But we see that there is very small communication between people and social network, and between social network and power. And I think that one of the good idea to develop some principles how social network, international social network, could communicate with local communities, for example, self-regulation or co-regulation and local power, to develop some principles and to develop these margins.
Some sort of charts.
To develop margins where they are not blocking and where they are blocking. Because, of course, I understand that if some moderator is sitting in Dublin and trying to moderate some Ukrainian post and he saw word Moscow, even in historical meaning, even in some poem, he blocked user, but it's not appropriate way to, it's censorship, frankly speaking. It's simple censorship. And I think the development to fighting with fake news also must be with coordination on social networks. And we know that Facebook trying to develop some and clean these fake profiles, and I think it's a good idea, but also we need some coordination, because in other case we will be only decision of such social networks will be they want to communicate, they want to resolve this problem or not. It's not a good way.
So to sum up, it would be the education of the public and communication between major players in this.
And establishing some also self-co-regulation rules, which are more effective sometimes than legislation, because legislation develops very long time. It's a long discussion. While you pass the legislation, you need to amend in this moment when you pass in this legislation. That's why I think we need also to promote this culture of and in Ukraine. This last year, at least, we saw that it could work, and we saw this cooperation with regulator of television and radio broadcasting, and penalties for the last case when Ukrainian channel was fined because of fake news about this meeting in Congress of USA, and I think it's a very good example when cooperation between media community and regulator give good results.
Well, that's then a good path or interesting path to follow. Well, thank you very much for this interview. It was a pleasure to have you in the studio. That was Ihor Rozkladay, an expert in the democracy, for democracy and rule of law. Thank you for watching the program. Stay tuned for the rest.